Good afternoon and welcome to Universum's first webinar on our annual Africa research. We've done our research in a number of African markets for the first time this year, which is a hugely exciting development for Universum, expanding our global footprint but also expanding our footprint on the African continent. We're really excited to share some of the findings from this research with you today. But just by way of introduction, my name is Jenny Skews and I'm an employer branding consultant from Universum South Africa. I sit in our Johannesburg office and I work very closely with a number of companies in both South Africa and other African markets, helping them to build strong employer brands. But before I get into why employer branding is important, I'd like to first just introduce Universum as we have a number of people who are joining us today for the first time, and this will be the first time they're ever interacting with Universum. So just to let you know a bit about Universum, we're the global leader in employer branding, having been working in the field for 25 years. Every year we survey over 1 million talent around the world who share their insights with us about which companies they'd like to work for, why, what their career expectations and preferences are, what their communications habits are, how they gather information about the companies that they'd like to work for. And what we do with this information is we use this to work in a very strategic manner to make data-driven decisions around how to attract talent to organizations. What we're seeing more and more is that employer branding and talent attraction is increasingly something that can be found on the CEO's agenda, because attracting the right kind of people to our businesses is a key differentiator between those businesses that are actually growing and achieving some kind of success and also achieving their business objectives. So what is employer branding and why is it important? Employer branding is basically the process of strategically communicating what you as an employer offer to both potential and current employees, with the objectives of firstly attracting the right kind of talent to your businesses, but also engaging and retaining the current talent that you have in your businesses. And this is a really important thing to do because firstly, it has really real effects on a business's bottom line. So some of those effects that we can see from some studies that other companies have done is that a strong employer brand can actually have a very real effect on revenue growth and profit margin increases. And those companies that work strategically with employer branding and have a strong employer brand actually see the benefits. But other benefits that employer branding have are being able to increase the quality of the people that apply, so getting more of the right kind of applicants. And also there's a number of effects on HR metrics, such as savings per hire, lower turnover, better quality of hire, lower time to fill, increased retention. The benefits go on and on. But basically what we do is we at Universum help companies to become more attractive as employers in order to be able to attract and retain the right talent for their organizations. Another very important concept in employer branding is the concept of the employer value proposition. So the employer value proposition is the unique set of offerings that a company offers both potential and current employees as an employer. And when we talk about a really good EVP, we say that it should be 5 things. It should be attractive in order to be able to attract the right kind of talent to your organization. And this is really important because in order to understand what's attractive to your key target groups, the only way to do it is really to ask them, so to go out and do some kind of market research on what the target groups that you're trying to attract to your organizations are actually looking for in the companies that they want to work for. Secondly, we say that a good EVP needs to be true. So what you communicate to the target groups or to the talent you're trying to attract actually needs to be true. And this is very important because if what you communicate is not true, obviously there's the potential of having retention issues or people becoming disillusioned when they join the organization. Thirdly, we believe that a good EVP needs to be credible. So what you communicate in the marketplace actually needs to be credible and believable to the talent that you're communicating with. Thirdly, we say that a good EVP needs to be sustainable. So there need to be some kind of golden threads that run through from the past of your organization, but that also will be sustainable in the near future. And finally, we say that a good EVP needs to be distinct. So while there are certain things where you need to be as good as your competitors, there also needs to be one or two things about your EVP that makes you stand out and that makes talent will have the effect of making talent choose your organization over your competitors. And why is understanding talent important, and why is research, really asking your target groups what they want and what's important to them important, And if you fail to understand your target audience, you risk spending time and money communicating things that do not resonate with candidates. So what we're really trying to do is we're trying to help companies to make data-driven decisions about what to communicate, which channels to communicate in. And this is directly related to the EVP. So having a very sound understanding of, first of all, about what's true and credible about your EVP, but also understanding what to prioritize in your communications in order to make sure that what you are communicating to talent is in fact attractive to them and distinct from your competitors. And we really believe that the best way to do that is to use market intelligence and talent insights. And why is this important? Well, I think one of the main reasons why this is important is that because the world is changing so fast, and soon millennials will actually make up a very large portion of all organizations, all companies' workforces. However, the extent to which companies are actually prepared for this generation remains to be seen, because they're a very diverse group with a very different perspective on the world, and of course also on work. So compared to, for example, baby boomers and other generations, they see work in a very different way. They see work as a thing you do, not a place you go to. And being able to understand what these differences are and what really drives young talent is actually we believe, is going to be a key differentiator of those organizations which are successful in the future and which are able to actually attract this young talent to their organizations. So, just to tell you a little bit about the markets that we currently cover in the Universum Talent Survey. At Universum, we talk about painting the world orange. And obviously, the long-term goal is to do our student research in every market around the world. And I think we are getting closer and closer every year to actually achieving this particular goal. But today we're going to be focusing on our most recent research that we've done on the continent in Africa, which is hugely exciting for us. So we're going to be looking at some findings from South Africa, from Ghana, from Kenya, from Nigeria, from Morocco, and from Algeria. When we think about millennials, there's a tendency towards talking about millennials as a group, as a cohort that exists on their own. But we've recently done, every year we do our research in all the different markets, but we also recently did an annual study on millennials in a number of markets. And one of the key things that came out of that is that millennials are actually more different than they are similar. So while there are a lot of things or a lot of similarities between millennials around the world, there are actually also a lot of very nuanced differences between millennials that sit in different markets. And being able to understand what those differences are and communicate in a way that resonates with millennials is going to be a key driver for businesses and whether they actually manage to attract talent to their organizations or not. So to start looking into some of the research, the first thing that we'll be looking at is who are those students who took part in our research this year? Who are the Afrillennials that we spoke to about their career preferences, expectations, and which companies they'd like to work for? So from Algeria, we saw that we had a very even gender split. The average age of the respondents was just under 22 years, and they had an average expected annual salary of just over 12,000 euros. From Morocco, we also had a fairly even gender split with slightly higher representation of females, also an average age of just over 21, and with a higher expected salary than the Algerian students. Looking at Ghana, we saw here actually a lower representation of females that took part in the survey, a slightly higher average age of 22, and quite a low average expected annual salary, with the Ghanaian students only expecting just over €8,500 in their first employment after graduation. In Nigeria, we saw a slightly higher representation of males as well. And extremely interesting here is that we see Nigerian students actually expect to earn almost just over double of what the Ghanaian students expect to earn in their first employment after graduation. In Kenya, we had once again a high representation of males with an average age of 21 and an average expected annual salary of just over €10,000 per annum. In South Africa, we saw the average age was just under 25, so we're looking at people who are really in the later years of their study here, and with an average expected annual salary of just under €20,000 per annum. So this diverse group of students, what are they looking forward to post-graduation? Where are they hoping to work? We see some extremely interesting findings coming out when we look at the African markets where we did the research. And one of the things that was most striking about especially about Kenya, Nigeria, and Ghana, was how important entrepreneurialism was in these markets. So if we look at these three markets, we see that in each market, almost 1/5 of the students actually hope to start their own business or work for a startup in their first job after graduation. And this is very interesting when we look a little bit later at what the career goals are that these students have. Another very interesting thing, I think, is that in all these markets, the top thing that students want to actually do after graduation is work for an international company or organization. This is really interesting because we saw a similar trend in a number of Asian markets about 8 to 10 years ago, where the international companies were actually extremely strong in the markets. However, as the economies grew, there was a tendency to actually, for the local companies to actually become stronger and more attractive to talent. The implication of this is obviously that there's a huge opportunity for international companies present in these markets to become really relevant to talent in those markets and to really capitalize on their attractiveness and on the fact that students want to work for international companies at the moment. In the event that we do see a similar trend to Asia, where the local companies become increasingly more attractive, it would be a good idea to really take advantage of this particular trend now. Then if we look at Algeria and Morocco, once again we see that working for an international company or organization is the top thing that students would like to do after graduation. But thereafter we see that they are actually very keen on continuing their studies, so for furthering their education. And the implication of this is that those companies that can perhaps offer some kind of support for continuing their education also have the potential to be extremely relevant to talent in those markets. So looking at these target groups, what's important to them, what drives them in terms of employer attractiveness. For those of you who are joining us for the first time today, I'd like to introduce the Universum Drivers of Employer Attractiveness to you. This is a model that we use in all our research, all around the world, and in all our surveys. And the great strength of that is it means that we're able to make comparisons, both historical and also between markets and between target groups. So what we do with this model is we first of all ask respondents in our research, which of these 40 attributes is the most important to you? And then we also ask them, which of these attributes do you associate with those companies that are your ideal employers? And then it's very easy for us to see how companies are perceived by talent versus what's important to talent, and then work very strategically with trying to shift the perceptions that exist about particular companies and align them with what's true about their EVPs and what they offer talent. So you'll see there's 4 categories in this model. There's the employer reputation and image, people and culture, remuneration and advancement opportunities, and also job characteristics. Obviously, the depth of this data that we've gathered from the respondents on particular companies is extremely detailed. So today we're going to be focusing on the preferences of the targeted talent. So, looking at the top 10 attributes driving employers' attractiveness per market, we see, and I think that one of the main takeaways from our research is how extremely different and the markets are and the students in the markets, although there are common threads that run through them. So, for example, if we look at an attribute like professional training and development, this is something that we see as common to all the markets that we surveyed, something that's really important to students in these markets. We also see something like a creative and dynamic work environment as being very important to the respondents, but to differing degrees. But if we look at what the top 3 attributes are first of all, in Algeria, Morocco, and South Africa, we can see that these are very, very different attributes between the markets. If we look at Ghana, Kenya, and Nigeria, we also see extremely different attributes coming through in terms of what are really driving students. But once again, we see similarities. So something like professional training and development is something that is common to all 6 markets. And although this is something that we'd really recommend if you do offer it, something to communicate, we also need to constantly bear in mind, is this something that makes companies distinct from their competitors? I think something else that's really striking about the 3 markets that we're looking at now, which is also similar about South Africa, is that we see remuneration and advancement opportunities. We see a lot of attributes from that particular category coming out very strongly. So students in these markets still very much driven by the remuneration and advancement opportunities that companies can offer. Okay, and then if we look at what the career goals are that are driving talent in these markets, if we look at the top 3 career goals for Nigeria, Morocco, and Algeria, we see being entrepreneurial, creative, work-life balance, and being dedicated to a cause or feel that I'm serving a greater good as the top 3 for Nigeria. This career goal of being entrepreneurial or creative is really, really interesting for us, because we see that for Nigeria, Kenya, and Ghana, this is actually the top career goal of students in these regions. This is not something that we actually commonly see in a lot of markets around the world, and we see this entrepreneurial flair coming out very strongly. And if you remember what students said they wanted to do after graduation, we saw that actually a fifth of students in those 3 markets were very interested in either working for a startup or starting their own business. And what this really means is that those companies that do offer some kind of intrapreneurship, being able to communicate that to talent, could help them to be more attractive and to be more relevant to talent in those markets. Another one that's really interesting that we see coming out, if we look at the top career goals for Ghana, Kenya, and South Africa, is that we see for Kenya the second most important career goal is to be dedicated to a cause or feel that I'm serving a greater good. And we're going to look into into the industries that Kenyan students actually want to work in later. And this is a really interesting trend we're seeing in Kenya. In South Africa, we see that the top 3 career goals are having work-life balance, being secure or stable in my job, and being dedicated to a cause or feel that I'm serving a greater good. This career goal of work-life balance, this is something that we see very, very commonly as a top career goal for both students and professionals in the research that we do all around the world. But what work-life balance actually means really differs from market to market, and really warrants further research into understanding what the nuances are about what work-life balance actually means. Does it mean living close to work, respect for its people, having control over working hours, flexible working conditions? And I think this once again points to the importance of actually understanding in a really granular way target groups in each market. The second career goal of South African students, to be secure or stable in my job, has also been a really interesting one. We've been conducting the research in South Africa for 12 years now, and we actually saw that this career goal increased in attractiveness over the last couple of years quite significantly. And we see that it's in direct response to a downturn in the economy. And what's really interesting about that is that talent preferences really reflect and respond to changes in the economy, which means that companies really need to respond in the same way about what they are communicating. So while communicating security and stability in the past was not that important, in South Africa now it is actually something that's extremely important to be able to communicate if it's true about your organizations. So, putting messaging out there that talks about hiring for careers and not jobs, or that companies are offering this secure and stable employment that's so important to talent. Okay, as I mentioned, we also ask the respondents in our research what they associate with particular companies, and we're just going to share a very high-level view of what some of the top-of-mind things that respondents associate with their ideal employers are. Those companies that are more interested in understanding exactly what, on a very, very granular level, what is associated with their particular companies, please do reach out to us, and we'll look into that. So, one of the things that we ask the respondents in the research is, what is the first word that comes to mind when you think of these employers? Or think of their ideal employers. And what we can see here is the top-of-mind associations with ideal employers in both Algeria and Morocco are things like prestige, money, innovation, leadership. And I think what's really interesting about this is that these are very aspirational words, but we don't see very strong EVP values coming through in these particular word clouds, which shows that that students are thinking about the companies that they want to work for in a very aspirational way. But I think it also indicates that they actually don't know that much about what companies are offering them. And if we look at both Ghana and Nigeria, we see very similar words coming through there. So innovation, money, prestige, all of these words coming through very, very strongly. And once again, as I said, I think that these are very aspirational words. But we're also seeing very words that reflect the economies of the company. So, for example, in Nigeria, seeing a word like oil, technology coming through, which shows us that, once again, that talent aren't associating companies very strongly with particular EVP values. If we look at the word clouds for Kenya and South Africa, once again, we see words like success, money, and innovation coming through very strongly. But in South Africa, we're starting to see some of the EVP values coming through a bit stronger. So things like opportunities, development, growth, innovation. And I think that this is because perhaps the employer branding market in South Africa is a bit more mature. So we're seeing that companies are actually strategically communicating with talent and communicating particular things about their EVPs. As I mentioned, we also asked the talent which industries they're hoping to work in, and this gives us a really interesting idea of which the top industries in each market are. And we see some very interesting things coming out here. So, for example, if we look at Kenya, we actually see that the top industry that talent in Kenya wants to go into is the non-governmental organization or non-profit organization industry. And if you think back to the career goals of Kenyan students, you'll remember that after being entrepreneurial and creative, being dedicated to a cause or serving a greater good was actually the top career goal for them. And I think that this is a great example of how important it is to understand talent in those markets on a really sort of detailed level is. Because what this means is that companies who are hoping to actually attract talent in Kenya perhaps have different recruitment competitors. So while you may think that you're actually competing with companies in your industry, if such a high percentage of students in Kenya are hoping to work in the NPO sector, it means that you may actually be competing with NPOs and NGOs. And being able to communicate your CSR and those kind of initiatives to talent would be one of the ways that you could potentially become more relevant in their eyes. We also see that in a lot of the economies, the industries that are really attractive are actually very reflective of the economies. So, for example, if we look at Nigeria, where the oil and gas and energy sector is obviously the biggest sector in their economy, we see that is also the most popular industry to go into, followed by telecoms and networks, and also engineering and manufacturing. In South Africa, really interesting, we see that educational and scientific institutions are one of the top industries that students are hoping to go into. And this has also been sort of something that's kind of shifted over the years. Very surprisingly, we don't even see that the mining industry even sits in the top 5 anymore. And this is once again a direct reflection of talents shifting preferences and how they respond to changes in the economy. So with the mining industry in South Africa going through a lot of instability and turmoil, over the last few years, we've actually seen it decrease a lot in attractiveness as an industry that South African students are hoping to go into. But if we look at the top two industries there, we see educational and scientific institutions and public sector and government agencies as the top 2 industries. This is really interesting because both of these industries are traditionally associated with a very high degree of security and stability. And what we saw was that security and stability has become increasingly important to talent in South Africa. And we see this also reflected in the industries that students and professionals are hoping to move into. If you remember, in Algeria, one of the top things that students were also hoping to do after they'd completed their undergraduate was to continue studying. So there we see that educational and scientific institutions is actually the top industry that students are hoping to go into. So being able to communicate some kind of support for continued studying could be a great way to become relevant in the eyes of talent in Algeria. In Morocco and Ghana, we see the banking industry as the top industry that students are hoping to go into. But in Ghana, also the energy industry, extremely popular. But I think this is really interesting because it once again highlights how different the students in all the markets are in terms of what they're looking for in their ideal employers, in terms of what drives them as in employer attractiveness, and what they're hoping to do and achieve in their careers in the long run, which shows how important it is for companies to be able to especially for global companies, to be able to localize their employer branding strategies. A lot of the companies that we work with on a global level come up with some kind of global strategy, and then it's handed down to the markets. But simply just implementing a global strategy at a local level very seldom works. It's really important to understand the differences and the nuances in each market in order to be able to stay relevant to the target groups and to stay relevant as an employer in each of those markets. Okay, so just to sort of summarize what we've discussed today, we've been looking at essentially millennials in a number of African markets. I don't know if anyone has heard this, a new term that's emerged, the Afrillennials. And the question that I'd like to pose is, Afrillennials, are they more similar or are they more different? And what we can see is that there are some consistencies and similarities in the region, if we look at Africa as a region. So for example, things like working for an international company or organization is highly valued, training and development, entrepreneurialism is very important. Money is also still a very important driver for students in these markets. But there's also a lot of differences, and being able to understand those differences, we really believe is going to be a key driver between those companies that manage to leverage off the extremely strong growth that is occurring in Africa, in a lot of African companies a lot of African markets at the moment, and those that don't. So understanding the key drivers in each market will give companies a competitive edge. So for example, looking at Kenyan students who feel like it's really important for them to be contributing to a greater good, being able to communicate that about your organization and to be able to communicate some kind of purpose and contribution to the greater good would make you more relevant. While being able to provide international opportunities, for example, for Algerian students who both want to have an international career as a career goal, but are also driven by working for an international company that offers the opportunities of international travel and relocation. Another very interesting thing that we saw is that the salary expectations vary hugely between the markets, but that women consistently expect to earn less. So this is obviously a challenge that needs to be addressed as well. So the main takeaway I'd say then is that each market needs to be approached as a unique market on its own, and to understand the individual talent groups in each of those markets. If we were to further segment the data, we'd also see great differences between different target groups. So, for example, between business students and engineering students, and being able to tap into that, we believe is really the only way to make data-driven decisions about how to go about strategically attracting talent to your businesses. So what's next? Today we've shared some very high-level insights about the research that we've undertaken in the African markets. The next thing that we'll be doing as Universum Africa is we'll actually be releasing our rankings with local media partners in each market. And when we send the follow-up email to this particular webinar, we'll include who those media partners are and also what the date of release is. But if any of you would like to find out if you have been listed and have been ranked in those markets, please feel free to reach out to us. So in terms of next steps, what we recommend is celebrating the rankings. So celebrating your employer branding success in the markets. And once that is done, to actually analyze the findings on a more detailed level. So to understand talent preferences and also how you're perceived as an employer in order to work more strategically in these markets. The next step then is to prioritize what is communicated to what target groups in each country. So to identify your unique selling points and prioritize what to communicate in which channels to which target groups. And then the next step is actually to activate. So to go about communicating in a data-driven way what your unique selling points are. And this is something that we as Universum work with a number of companies already on. So throughout the whole employer branding journey. So first understanding target groups through market intelligence, understanding your internal identity, and then developing some kind of strategy based on this, including a communication strategy and actually executing that strategy, and finally measuring the success of that strategy in order to make it even more successful in the next employer branding cycle. So thank you all for joining us today. I'll quickly take some questions. You'll see that there's a little place where you can type in questions. So please do field those questions there and I will address them. Okay, Gijs has asked whether we will be conducting our research in other African markets this year. He's especially interested in Mozambique. We are hoping to expand our research into a number of other African markets this year. So if there are any markets that anyone is particularly interested in, please do feel free to reach out directly to your local CAM or to either myself or Luvuyo, who sits in South Africa and is responsible for the African markets, and let us know which markets you are particularly interested in. There's also been a question, how do you get insights, company-specific insights, and is there a fee involved? Yes, there is. Yes, we definitely do have insights available on particular companies that were included in our company lists, and there is a fee involved. I can't tell you off the top of my head what that fee is, because we work in a very tailor-made way with each company. So looking at each company's particular challenges, particular target groups, and then coming up with a strategy based on that. So we don't come with the one-size-fits-all solution, but deal with each of our clients on a case-to-case basis. Okay, are there any other questions? If not, thank you very much for your time. As I mentioned, we will be sending a follow-up email which will include the ranking release dates and media partners for each individual market. So please feel free to also reach out if you'd like to find out more about the research in the markets, or about your particular companies and how they have been ranked. Thank you very much for your time, everyone, and have a great day further.